Hi, I'm Julie Kratz. I am a TEDx speaker and inclusive leadership developer. I have authored books about workplace inclusion, like Lead Like an Ally. And today on the show, we unpack unconscious bias, how to handle pesky microaggressions that happen in the workplace, and talk about what it's like to be a white woman leading diversity work in corporate America.
Welcome back to the delicious conversation here on Leadership and Loyalty with my guest, Julie Kratz. Her latest book is Lead Like an Ally, a journey through corporate America with strategies to facilitate inclusion. Julie has developed inclusive workshops, workplace cultures through allyship across gender, race, and other dimensions of diversity. She is a TEDx speaker, and she is an inclusive leadership trainer and an executive coach. And before we were in part one, we talked about really confronting what those three things are. What is diversity? What is inclusion? What is allyship? We talked about that. We talked about the where we get stuck, and we talked about confronting ego and how you want to be oftentimes you really want to be an inclusive leader, just don't know how to be it. And we also talked about confronting that desire to hide from feeling stupid by admitting that you need to know something. So we was pretty deep there. We went some really great stuff, and I hope that you did catch part one. In part two here, I want to address some of the unconscious bias, because I think this is an important point. I know it's something you speak a lot about, Julie. So as part of that unconscious bias, I'm going to ask you to sort of look into that more detailed in a moment. But one of the pushbacks that you and I talked about in a previous conversation that we've all heard around diversity is that leaders will often claim that it means lowering the standard somehow. Why can't we just hire on merit is one of the things I know I've heard it a lot, and I'm sure I've heard it much less than you have. So talk to us about that.
Oh, I know. I instinctively roll my eyes when I hear that statement because I have heard it so many times. It's actually a scenario we use in our unconscious bias training. It's that common. But yeah, I mean, what you're saying is it's one of these biased patterns of thought if we're not careful to break these things down. So the way our brain works, our brain is very much a category-based system, right? So we see somebody, a lot of times we want to place them into a category, for example, male, female, or, brown, black, white, whatever it is. We want to put them in that category. And our brain, if we're not careful, when we place them in that category, can make assumptions about that person based on previous people we've encountered that fit that category. Absolutely. Part of this is for our brain survival. We got to make tough decisions. We used to be chased by saber-toothed tigers. That was really helpful when you had to assess trust with somebody instantly. Today's world, not so much, not so relevant. So with unconscious bias, it's really recognizing where my biases might be, and then slowing your brain down a little bit before it instinctively makes that assumption-based decision that could result in problematic behavior. We just want to slow it down and just ask ourselves a couple reflection questions. How do I know that's true? Based on what information? Hey, is there more to the story than what meets the eye? Okay, just those types of reflection questions. So back to the example you gave, before we assume diverse talent somehow is subpar or not meeting the same standards, maybe we should ask ourselves that question. Well, how do I know that that person doesn't meet the standards? Or what assumption could I be making here that may not be accurate? And oftentimes we assume the majority group, which majority group, another term from the dictionary, is generally speaking the people that hold the most power and privilege in a given society. Well, here in North America, that is generally white, straight, cisgender males. Like, big surprise, right? 80% or so of leadership roles fulfill that demographic. So what you don't know is by being in that majority group, because you're so well represented, especially at the leadership ranks, people might unfairly give you a leg up or make assumptions about you that you're perfectly capable as a leader because you look like the profile of leadership at my organization or what I've been accustomed to.
Mm-hmm.
Conversely, a woman, a person of color, someone with a disability, seeing them in a leadership role, you're going to be like, double take, right? I don't see that very often.
Right.
I might make the assumption that somehow they're not as equipped in that role, not based on actual data, not based on actual qualifications, but just because my brain hasn't seen that enough before to normalize it. This is the real chicken and egg problem we have with diversity. Is we need representation at the top. At the same time, it's hard to see what you haven't seen before, right? And so we have to be really intentional when we're hiring and when we're recruiting and making promotion decisions that we're getting diverse slates, and we always hire for the best talent. We always promote the best talent. But if we could be more intentional in making sure to diversify those candidate pools on the front end, best practices show that's going to eliminate some of the bias that can creep up in the process.
Well, there was a really great experiment. You probably know this even better than I do. A really great experiment that was done. I can't even remember when it was. And the experiment was done with people applying for jobs. And the people who applied for jobs who were equally qualified, but some of those people had black names, like Tyrone or whatever is, typical, biased names, right?
Sure.
So they're very black names, and that they didn't get the interviews with equal qualifications to the Brads and the Chads, right? So the Brads and Chads were getting more interviews. So they did the thing again with a new group, and they changed all the Javons and all those names that were, Umfufu or whatever it might be, what name that was more traditionally black, and they changed it to Susan and John, and they just changed them. And guess what? The same people got the interviews. But what was more fascinating was the response of the interviewer being surprised at this very white name. Right. Mm-hmm. So I had a Chinese friend years ago. Her name was Julie Davies. And I remember this was the early 90s. And she goes, she loves having that name because her dad is white and her mom is Chinese. Right. So she's Julie Davies, but she looks very Chinese. And she goes, I love walking in and just watching their faces because they just don't know. Right. Mm-hmm. They just don't know. And so that's part of the challenge is, what are you carrying around in your coconut that says this person is that? Mm-hmm. And how do we get people to confront that, Julie? I mean, it's because, again, like I said, unconscious, the problem with unconscious is it's unconscious.
Right. How do you bring it into your conscious mind?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and just to underscore two things you're talking about, that study has been replicated many times over the years. Right. Of the black name, swap out white name on the resume, 50% more callbacks to the white name. So this is just the reality of the situation we live in. Harvard and other reputable organizations have studied this. The other piece of this is the potential versus performance bias. A lot of times we assess, especially from a gender perspective, we assess men based on potential and women based on performance, which means women have to prove themselves over and over again, whereas a man just kind of has to show up and be we have faith that he can do the job. This is why men, on average need to fit about 60% of the criteria for a job to apply for it, whereas women actually take it as these are criteria. I better hit 9 out of the 10 at least. So this shows up in harmful workplace behavior. And at the end of the day, why we need to confront this is you're not getting the most from your talent if people feel like they're not being included or given the same opportunities with the same qualifications and expertise. And they're going to see it over and over again being overlooked, or, so-and-so being promoted because he's a go-getter and he'll figure it out. It's disheartening to everyone. Yeah. And there's a real human need for fairness. And I think that's where we're reconciling around now is how do we create these inclusive spaces where people really legitimately feel like they're treated fairly? And this is where bias comes in. We've got to label it. We've got to have tools to slow it down in the moment. We have to have ways to call people in when they have problematic bias behavior. But it all goes back to the central point that you've explored really well, is self-awareness. Like
Mm-hmm.
I have to own that. Like no one else can get self-aware for me. There's an implicit,
unfortunately.
right? Like that's on
Where's
me.
that chip that goes in the back of my head?
Right? Yeah, just boot me up. And I wish I had some sort of magic bullet solution for folks. But I will say start with self-awareness. That's where all of our content always starts, is take a look in the mirror and think, where are my biases? And if you want to get comfortable with this, I would just unpack it a little bit. Like think about your exposure to different races growing up and through present day. Think about gender roles. What was modeled for you in your home growing up? That has a huge impact on how you see gender today.
Of course.
Think about people in your network today. How diverse is it? Right? Think about the people on your text string. Just open your phone and look at the people you text most often, you choose to communicate with the most. Are they like you? If you're like me 5 years ago, when I really started getting into this work, it was a lot of white women, mothers, business owners, like, mirror. That's affinity bias. As human beings, we feel more comfortable with people like us, that we can just be ourselves around. And the thing about that is, though, the danger with that is we don't learn as much from people like us. We really only learn from people that are different than us, that have that different perspective. And that's the wow factor with diversity, is when you get those different perspectives, right? Innovation numbers go up, decision making goes up, profitability goes up. And we were literally leaving money on the table by not addressing harmful workplace behavior.
But for me, and again, I'm going to talk about it from a psychological point of view because that's my side. So much of that is due to, as you said, a lack of exposure, but a lack of desire of exposure. And what I mean by that is, I believe it's somewhere in the range of 60% of Americans don't own a passport. Well, you're not going to get very diverse if you've not been outside of your own country, let alone outside of your own town or village. And there's a lot of Americans who've never traveled. And even the ones who make it to the top and are traveling, oftentimes are traveling with business, with the company, and they're the big boss. They don't get an experience of culture. As a speaker, I'm a speaker and have been for 30 odd years. And I will often say, being a speaker is a second-hand rock star. And people go, what do you mean? I'm not as famous as rock stars. My life's not as sexy as a rock star. But like a rock star, I arrive in a city, I do what I'm there to do, and I get out. And so I don't really know. I actually try, if my schedule allow me, to spend a day on the other side and go, okay. And I say to people, tell me where to go that the tourists don't go. Right. And and when I went to Iran and I came back from Iran, I stayed in Iran extra time, and I came back and I wrote a piece on it called The 12 Myths About It, Myth Busting Facts About Iran, because it was like, because I would just come back and I just asked, tell me about Iran. When I was going, people were like, oh, are you going to be safe? People were terrified for me, genuinely. And when I came back, I said, tell me about Iran. People told me, I was like, oh my God, like you'd no idea. So I wrote these things like, do you know more, the percentage of women with MBAs over American women with MBAs? Way higher in Iran. Do you know that education is free? No. Do you know that most Iranians don't understand why America doesn't like them? I had to explain, America doesn't dislike you. The American propaganda does, but, do you understand that they're not running around with turbans on the head riding camels? Tehran is a very modern city with Mercedes and shitty old second-hand cars and people shuffling their kids to school and going shopping. It's all very normal. But we have these classifications that have been fed to us that say Muslim people are like this, brown people are like that, Chinese people are like that, black people are like that. They're all gangsters. What craziness. But I mean, I see it because it's really interesting for me because I'm a white guy and I get it. And people go, oh, it must have been so nice growing up in England. I'm like, what? And they go, it's so, I watched Downton Abbey and those things. And, you're so fortunate. And I'm like, I grew up in a ghetto. What are you talking about? Northern England, poor ghetto, no food, no money, crime, violence, addiction. Those shitty places you see in Chicago? Yeah. They were upmarket from where I was born. Really? Yeah. It's like, so that bias is, as you said, it's completely unconscious and we don't realize it. And so if you want to use me as the example of, oh, here's a white guy, that's a good idea, because bias is not necessarily about race or color or even sexuality. It's about how do you frame something that may not be what it is. And I love that you're asking people to question that. So one of the examples I'll give is this. Have you ever met somebody called Julie? And they'll go, yeah. Did you ever have an experience that was a profoundly painful or dark experience with a person called Julie? And somebody in the room will, right? And I'll say, now, I want to introduce you to Julie. Do you think you maybe have a little bit of bias?
Mm-hmm.
You think it comes up, even for a second, that you're like, her name is Julie.
Yeah. We have a lot of preconceived notions about who Julie is. Probably,
right, because
probably assume female, probably assume white. I don't know. I haven't met a lot of women of color named Julie. Like, and this is something our brain does without us even thinking about.
Exactly.
It.
That's
we know
my
Julie.
point here. It's categorizing and filtering and doing all those things. And if you've had a profoundly emotionally negative experience with somebody, it is going to overlay that onto the next person with that label, that name, because the name's just a label. And by the way, if you met a Julie in your childhood who was lovely, and you can't think of a Julie you knew, but you always think of Julie Andrews, and you meet Julie Kratz, you're going to have, the hills are alive with the sound of Julie, right? With the sound of diversity. So, it's really important for us to understand these biases. And I love that you're bringing this to the fore with people to have them question that. So that's why I say, please, if you're listening to us today, rather than thinking about gender or sex or color or religion or anything, think about it in this very simple way of who in your past had a profound emotional experience on you, positive or negative, and then put that on to somebody else, exactly the same color, no different. Put it on somebody with the same color and see if you don't automatically have a bias. That's all we're talking about here.
Yeah.
That's all we're saying. You have a bias. You don't know it. Here's how to discover it, so that when you look at that person who's different color or whatever than you can say, oh, this might be from somewhere in history.
Yeah. Yeah. And our brain's recording things for survival, right? And so especially if you had a negative experience with somebody, we know that our brain records negative experiences at a higher rate than positive experiences. So if you had trauma happen with somebody that was a different skin color than you, or sexual orientation than you, or with a disability, whatever it is, whatever dimension of difference, fast forward to present day, you're likely to judge people with that same association based on that negative experience, unfairly so. Another point you made that I love to reiterate is we fear what we don't understand. I think this is a huge part of the diversity problem is, well, I don't know what it's like to not be white, right? I have white skin. Well, no one's asking you as an ally to know what it's like to have black or brown skin. Like, they're just asking you to empathize, to listen, to believe them when they share hard things with you, and to amplify their voices. Like, those are the things that you're being asked of. You're not being asked to know all of the nuances of someone else's lived experience. So if only we just put down the shield, that fear factor more with like, I don't understand it and I want to, right? Or yes. I don't understand it yet. I like to use the word yet a lot. Like, they don't get it yet. They're not an ally yet. And we're all allies in training. We always will be for, as long as it goes on, it's never going to end. But I think just that openness, that curiosity, staying in that moment just a little bit longer and recognize knee jerk. Ooh, they're different. And you know this, if you ever went into a place where you were the only person with your skin color, the only person with your gender, whatever it was, and this happened to me a lot in my corporate days, it was like always the only woman in a setting. It's uncomfortable. Like you don't fit in, right? And that you're different. And a lot of times we'll just naturally, unconsciously adjust our behavior to fit in those settings. And what ends up happening is you're not really getting the most out of that person because they're having to constantly filter and be like, is it safe to do this? Like, I didn't wear makeup or jewelry. I wore masculine clothing nearly my entire corporate career. And there's no way I was contributing the best ideas or being as productive or creating the quality content that I could have been creating, because that mental Olympics I was having to do all the time. And unfortunately, this is still the state of corporate America.
Well, as you said, you're putting energy into the shield, right? So that shield is the hyper-vigilant awareness of saying, can I say that? No, I can't. Can I do this? No, I can't. And that energy is now sucking away from all the creativity and the insight that you would have if you didn't have to concern yourself with that stuff. And and there's part of the new research around the people who were working remotely. Even though they were under enormous amounts of stress, many of them were more creative because they felt less restricted. That's, it's very interesting, the psychological impact of not having to be on guard. And how that is so valuable to creativity and input. So I want to get into a practicality here because I know this is your specialty. I want you to give us a little bit, maybe you can give us a story or some practicality of inclusion. How do we start these inclusion conversations? So again, this is not calling somebody out in a meeting. This is, let's just start this. Like, how do we start having the conversations that we don't know how to have?
Yeah. And we're always a big fan. Meet people where they're at. So if your organization hasn't done much with DEI, it's not too late. It's never too late. Like, you can still do things. You just need to do something. So that's what I always say, like, do something. Just do something, like baby steps. But, share it in the form of a story. It reminds me of the work I was doing with a client this time last year. George Floyd happened, social unrest, every organization's donating and making these statements. And this organization came to me. They're an IT consultant firm, so very white male heavy. And their leader said, we want to do something, but we really thought about it and we want to be intentional with this. And we don't want to just check the box, which was like, thank you, because that doesn't work.
No.
But they all read a book together. I believe the book was So You Want to Talk About Race, which there's tons of great anti-racism book reads on my website. You can check out our full resource list. But that's a great book. It doesn't matter. Just pick a book, pick something to talk about together. But they said it like opened up this huge conversation about race, and just realizing of their leadership team, they had no people of color. I believe they had one woman who's usually a token woman in HR marketing. It was very much that scenario. And people weren't talking openly. So that got the conversation started with some tools and exercises as a leadership team. And then they said, hey, Julie, we really need to have like a strategy around this, just like we would, by the way, of any other important part of our business. We would have a strategy. Yeah. So I'm always shocked when organizations are like, it's important, but we don't have a DEI strategy. It's like, well, then it's not important. So just don't say that.
Exactly.
But so they recognized the need. We did an assessment of their leadership team to see where they were at, where they wanted to go, and put pen to paper on a really cool strategy that very quickly, succinctly, in one sentence, they could all rattle off and say, this is what we mean about diversity, equity, inclusion, and why it matters to us. And they wove it into their core values, which I thought was really cool. So their values wrapped right around their diversity vision and their strategy statement. And then that's really the fun part, is then you get to roadmap out and kind of plan the activities that fulfill that vision, right? So you have that high level look, and then it's like, okay, what do we need to do to make this statement true? And kept asking that question. Education, it's probably 80% of that journey is education, and that needs to be consistent and intentional. And your senior leadership team needs to be at those programs. And you need to be willing to hold people accountable, right? So accountability and really looking through the lens of the entire employee experience. And this is where everyone went, right? To recruiting and hiring. You need to think about,
of course,
what's going to make them want to stay, though.
Yep.
It's like you can recruit and hire diverse talent, and then a year later lose them because they're having to do all this filtering, like we were talking about. There's not really inclusive. And thinking about, who we're promoting and who we're not promoting, and who we're giving pay increases to and who we're not. You really need to be willing to look through all of the different lenses of the employee experience through the lens of inclusion and say, how inclusive are we, right? Are we really treating people fairly and respectfully at every single layer? Because you peel back that onion, You do some focus groups or you do some assessments, and people will tell me how they really feel. And it's hard. It's hard as a leader to hear these things. That client, we just wrapped up our engagement, a year later, but they were still struggling. The people of color there did not feel like their voices were being heard. Quite frankly, as a white woman, I wasn't well received doing the work because of that. And so there's just like all this nuance to it. But I say that to say, do something. Like pick one thing. The book club thing's not a bad idea, but you got to do something else besides just that. And just stay on the journey. Don't get off, right? Especially when it goes out of the news cycle. It's really easy to hit the easy button and just go back to status quo.
Well, diversity and inclusion has been a pretty hot subject for about 5 years. And the pandemic hit beginning of 2020, and everybody's diversity and inclusion budget disappeared. And then George Floyd happened, and everybody's like scrambling, how do we get diversity and inclusion? So it just shows how bullshit it was.
That was the most depressing part of probably my career ever, was March and April, when companies were just telling me like, Julie, I can't talk about this right now. Like we have other important stuff. It's just, and it's like breaking my heart.
Yeah. So sad. But having said that, let's address the elephant in the podcast. That would be you. You're a diversity and inclusion expert. You're doing all this great work, wonderful work. And you is white. You is a white American woman. So, yeah, I'm thinking, I'm a brown person. I'm of some varying shade. I'm of a particular gender of varying shade, or whatever it might be on that 48 options on Facebook or whatever it is. And you, a straight white woman with kids, is coming in to talk to me about diversity? I don't think so, bro. So talk to us about that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you just described like half of my first client calls are like, so you're white. I'm like, I'm aware. I am aware.
I've noticed that.
But I think it is the elephant in the room that you just have to kind of put out there. When I teach or when I talk about diversity, I say, hey, I realize, 4 out of the 5 main dimensions of diversity, I'm in the in group, right? I'm white, cisgender, I'm straight. It's just really being female. I have all my abilities, at least currently. So it's really just the female factor. And so with that comes a tremendous amount of privilege, and privilege is a chance to be an ally. And especially around issues of race, I firmly believe this with my friends of color, that they cannot be solely responsible for carrying forward this conversation about anti-racism. We absolutely need 100% of the population to solve 100% of the problem. And when we don't include white voices in this conversation, unfortunately, we're not talking a lot of connecting with decision makers. So it's really making sure in my work, where I firmly believe it's that we need our white allies to step into the conversation, especially around issues of race. And then, of course, if we ever do programs that are specifically about anti-racism or privilege, we have partners that are people of color that join us in those programs too. So you've got to know your own limitations. And I always say that, like, I have white skin. I will never understand fully the lived experiences of people of color, but I'm going to listen and I'm going to learn and I'm going to empathize the best of my ability as an ally. And I'm going to keep showing up. And most of the time people are like, okay, cool, she knows. And then they feel more comfortable, but
so
we need our voices.
So we're coming towards the end of the show, but I do want to ask, what was the point for you? Like, was there a turning point for you when you suddenly became like, this became so important to you? Because again, being the elephant in the room, it's easy to sort of, as we've talked about, have your own unconscious bias and not even notice. What was it for you that got you to go, this is what I got to speak to?
Yeah, I think what I always thought growing up, so I was raised by a single mom, similar circumstances, to not severe poverty, but I would say very, very low disposable income growing up. And so when I did get the chance to go to college and like find who I wanted to be, I was like gravitated towards women's studies. And I remember they had a lot of curriculum intentionally on the lived experiences of women of color. And I remember reading, Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and being like, oh, their experiences are so different than mine. And I found it so intriguing. So I think that was kind of my wake up moment. And I remember telling my mom, like, okay, I'm going to go into corporate. I'm going to be this like badass businesswoman. She's like, I don't think so. I think your purpose is to help women. I was like, yeah, whatever, mom. No one like makes money doing that. So unfortunately, my mom passed away when I was in my early 20s. And so those words, you know how like your parents' words like come back to you, like it came back to me a lot of like, your purpose is to help women. And I thought, this corporate thing's not working out so well. I'm really getting sick of all this filtering and covering and not feeling like I belong anywhere. So that's 7 years ago when I started Next Pivot Point. It was really my mom's words lingering in my brain. But what's been updated on that talk track is all women, all people, really, all people that are different, that don't feel like they fit in. I want to be as helpful as possible because everybody deserves to feel seen, heard, and belong. And especially our children. I mean, that's a huge part of my work right now, is starting this conversation earlier, talking to adults for the last 7 years. It's like a little harder to change behavior later in life. So even bringing this conversation forward earlier. And I just know the more I've done this work and really done the hard work, and it's hard, it's tenuous, I feel like I've become a better human, better caregiver, a better partner, a better listener, a better friend. And I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful that I get to do that kind of work aligned with my purpose, because not everyone gets to.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. We are at the end of this show. I want to make sure that people know where to find your book, the name of your book, your website, your social, where's the best place you. And of course, we'll put all that in the show notes. But if you would, please just once again, tell everybody where they can find out more about you and all the wonderful work you're doing.
Oh, thanks for that. Nextpivotpoint.com is where you want to go. You can download the diversity dictionary and all sorts of conversation tools to support your ally journey. And then I also post daily on LinkedIn. So be sure to check that out. Julie Kratz, Kratz. I'd love to hear from you. If this message resonates, send me a note. I reply to all of emails, usually same day.
So again, nextpivotpoint.com. You can find the book, of course, on Amazon, and you can follow Julie and her work, as she said, on LinkedIn. And we, of course, will make sure all those links are posted into the show notes. Again, thank you so much, Julie. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Love talking to you. Thank you for all that you've shared. It's been amazing.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
And for you, dear listener, remember that you can hang out and talk with other conscious leaders. You can chat about this episode or any past episodes you've been listening to inside of our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. Truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your true capability. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or leadership strategist for yourself or your organization, simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. Because unified, actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness in all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about how you can confront your own unconscious bias. Remember, just takes remembering a name and then looking back, and then apply that across color and gender and every possible way you can. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.